Hello, and welcome to the Cluster API sub-project meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle for Wednesday, January 16th. Today, I wanted to kick off the meeting giving sort of a recap of some work that various folks, many of which are on the call today, did sort of at the end of last week, which is issue triage. So following the example from the kubeadm repository, and this is something I think that we're going to try to do a little bit better job standardizing across all of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We went through and cleared out the backlog by closing or duping or moving issues out of the repo. And what we were left with, we sorted into two milestones. And so the milestones are linked to the meeting notes. There's a milestone called V1 Alpha 1, which is basically things we are working on right now. This is targeted as our sort of next release, and in this case, our first release. But in general, in the future, it's basically there's a milestone of things we're working on now that we want to cut a release for next. So Tim, licked his finger and picked the date out of the air, which was the end of March, when we hope to have all of these tasks finished. That sort of lines up with the current release cycle for core Kubernetes. For kubeadm, that's really important because they are tied to the actual release of Kubernetes. For Cluster API, it's less important, but there is still some benefit of trying to sort of align with their schedule in terms of marketing and using their release notes and blogging platform and so forth, and the marketing push around release to sort of advertise our progress. So let me share my screen real quick. I think it's this one. So I pulled up, you guys can see this, right? This is the V1 Alpha 1 milestone. You can see that there are 23 issues in this milestone. And then also, I guess, 5 that have been closed. We don't really care about those too much. But the important part here is the issues in this milestone are the things we think are most important. Most of them have been labeled as priority important soon, except for sort of support issues, and important soon or important urgent. And these are things that we sort of expect people to be working on as their top priority as they contribute to the project. We also tried for the people that were there to assign the issues as we went, so that we'd actually have an assignee that we could poke sort of on a weekly or basis or so to try and drive each of these to resolution. What we did with the remaining issues is we stuck them into another milestone that's called next. So the idea is when we finish the V1 Alpha milestone, we will create a milestone that'll be called V1 Alpha 2 or V1 Beta 1, whatever we think the next release will be called. We will triage everything that's in the next milestone and see what should be pulled forward into, we'll call it the V1 Beta 1 milestone. And then the things that we don't think are important to work on right away for beta would be left in the next milestone. So next is just sort of a backlog of other things that we are tracking that we don't expect to get done soon, but that we don't want to close as if we will never do. The nice thing about putting things into the next milestone is that if we go look at issues and we look for issues that don't have a milestone, we can see things that haven't been triaged yet. And then we can go through and say, for each of these issues, should they be put in the V1 Alpha milestone or the next milestone? And it makes it really easy to sort of keep up with the incoming issues and make sure they get properly categorized. So what I would like to do going forward is spend a little bit of time each meeting sort of looking at the V1 Alpha milestone, at least looking at the aggregate numbers and seeing if we're sort of trending in the right direction towards actually closing things. As we spend time sort of discussing issues and PRs, I'd like to, as a group, try to prioritize the ones that are part of the milestones so we can focus our attention on the things that we think are important to get done so we can actually get releases out the door. And try to get this list of issues burned down. So if you look at sort of the right-hand side, most of these have an assignee so far. The other thing I'll point out is that the approach that the kubeadm folks take, which I think we should adopt, is that even if an issue has an assignee, it doesn't mean you can't work on it. Assignee is sort of the person responsible for driving the issue to completion. Oftentimes people will mark an issue as lifecycle active to indicate they're actually writing code for it. Or sometimes the assignee will be sort of delegating pieces of the work to other people or sort of driving a process to completion. So just because things are assigned doesn't mean there aren't places people can contribute and contribute in the short term to things that are really important. If there's something you want to work on, please reach out to the assignee that a lot of people have multiple things assigned, and they would probably be happy to let people jump in and help if there's something someone's really excited or interested to work on. So the list is 23 things long. I don't want to go through every single one here because we did that last week. But I would encourage people, if you're interested, to go through and look at the split between Alpha 1 and Next. Make sure that there's nothing in the Next backlog that you think really should have been part of Alpha 1. If there is, please comment on the issue and or bring it up at this meeting. And if there are things you think that are in Alpha 1 that actually aren't that important, that would be great to mention also, and we can talk about kicking things out. One side note is that there are a couple things we stuck in the Alpha 1 milestone that we didn't feel like would be blocking a release, but we wanted to put in the milestone to keep tracking them in the short term because we either are optimistically hopeful that they'll get done or we think part of the issue will get done. And so as we get close to the end of the milestone, there are definitely ones that we're happy to punt to the next one. We know already that some of those things can be punted and we'll be okay. So any questions, comments, concerns?
I think this looks great. I have one naming nitpick, which is next implies it will be done next, and that may create the wrong implication. And like what we did in other repos is we called it backlog. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point. As I was trying to describe this, I said, we're going to be doing V1 Alpha 1 next, right? But there's also something called next, right? Which is, I think, a little bit confusing. Tim promised to write up a description of how Kube8m has been doing this, that we can sort of socialize across the SIG as a whole. And I think when he does that, that would be a great time to give him that feedback, because I'd love for us to all change it from next to backlog or some other name that we think is better together, right? We can rename ours, but then we're less consistent with the rest of the SIG, and it makes it harder for someone who's contributing to Kube8m to easily come over here and sort of find the things that they're looking for.
You're not necessarily less consistent with the rest of the SIG if COPS is doing the other one. You're you're the casting vote right now.
That is a good point, yes. Well, so there's the cluster API repo, the cluster API provider AWS repo, the cluster API provider GCP repo are now all following this.
You got 3 votes. That seems unfair. But yes, anyway, I don't want to rattle on it. But yeah, I think your suggestion when he writes up the doc of commenting there is the right way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that would be really easy for us to make a really quick change across the board. But I don't want to have to change it over and over as we debate names. So let's do that once. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Other comments, questions, concerns? Cool. So there are 23 things. Maybe if we don't have much of an agenda, we can pull those back up and actually go through them during this meeting. But I see people are adding stuff to the meeting notes. So I think we should go through those first and see if there's other urgent things for people to discuss. Next on the list, I put something here, which was I got an email from the organizers of KubeCon in Barcelona, KubeCon EU 2019, about setting up SIG sessions, right? So in Seattle, we had a SIG intro and 2 SIG deep dives, one of which was Kube8m and one of which was Cluster API. In China, we had a SIG intro and a SIG deep dive. And in KubeCon last year, we had a SIG intro and a SIG deep dive. So one thing is when we were doing the deep dive for Cluster API in Seattle, we had a number of folks that were interested in helping sort of co-present that session. Obviously, we can't have 6 people up presenting. And so there were just 2 of us presenting, myself and David. And I would like to sort of open it back up to people and see who's interested, who thinks they might be attending Barcelona anyway, and who'd like to present in Barcelona. So I think we'll probably end up signing up for a session anyway, because I think there will be enough interest. But just sort of a heads up, if you are interested, we should start sort of whittling down the list and trying to nominate some people to represent us in Barcelona. I'm also not particularly clear on how we should be picking deep dive sessions for these things, right? Because KubeSpray had a talk accepted via CFP in Seattle. Minikube had a talk accepted via CFP, but Kube8m and Cluster API just sort of got talks for free via the SIG process. And I'm not sure how fair that is to all of the sub-projects, like you were mentioning, Justin. Should we do a deep dive on COPS instead of Cluster API? Should we do a deep dive on Bootkube, or pick some other SIG project, right? And how we pick those, right? Our SIG is difficult because we can't really do a single deep dive that's actually meaningful. We have to pick something to deep dive on. And so I guess we didn't talk about that yesterday in the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting, but we probably should in the next meeting is how we want to divvy that up.
It's also tricky because like I was thinking of proposing a talk about like how COPS adopted the cluster API, because it will be in May, right? And
yes.
like if that gets accepted, right, then obviously I shouldn't do a cluster API deep dive because I'll cover that aspect, and I shouldn't do a COPS API deep dive, or COPS deep dive because that element will be there. And so it's like conditional on the CFP acceptances. So I just
True, right? I mean, I think the other tricky part is we need to sort of sign up for these now, and they're not going to say like, great, your SIG gets 8 different deep dives, right?
We can ask for 8, and then we can be whittled down to 4. But yes,
that's true. I guess we could always ask for 8.
So that's interesting, actually. How does so you have to request these?
Yes,
and then you'll get them for free. The CFPs are contingent on approval.
Yes.
So Justin has said that he's proposing a deep dive. I know that Daniel, Jason, and myself have also suggested 2 different deep dives, only one of which is directly cluster API related. It's kind of hard to know how to pick which cluster API deep dive we propose now when we don't know which ones will be approved.
Right.
Sorry, are you saying you proposed deep dives through the CFP process, or?
We intend to propose a CFP. We intend to propose a deep dive for cluster API bare metal through the CFP process.
So,
yeah.
So Mark,
Go ahead.
SIG cloud provider is running into the same issue also, because we have a bunch of providers who are SIGs, which will, they typically get the deep dives, but then some cloud providers who don't get the deep dives. And we have a proposal to the we're writing a proposal to the technical committee to the technical steering committee to figure out how to handle this. I can dig that up and share it with y'all in case we want to broaden the scope of that, so we can kind of figure out larger as a community when these SIGs have multiple SIGs or working groups underneath them, how we, how they're handled at events like KubeCon. So I'll dig that up and post a link to it so you can see what we're working on. Okay,
that would be great. I'm trying to dig through my email real quick to figure out what the deadline is.
The 17th.
So well, that's a deadline for the
CFP. I think it's March. Right. Is it February 2nd or March 2nd? I can't remember, but it's like it is after.
It's February 8th. So we have a little bit more time.
One thing we could do is we can submit all our CFPs as per normal, and the sort of the track reviewers and track assemblers will sort that out. And then if we also do deep dives based on the idea that we don't get any CFPs, if we do get a CFP that negates entirely a deep dive, we could reassign the deep dive to something else. Like we have enough in our SIG cluster lifecycle ecosystem that we could actually do that.
Right. So the question is sort of how, like last time I was like, I really want more than one deep dive, right? One doesn't work. And we got 2, which was great. And so I think the question like Chris is proposing is like, how many should we ask for? Should we ask for 4? Should we ask for 5? Is like 2 a reasonable upper bound? And then yes, we can sort of change the topic of those, but like how many should we ask for to start with? Because we probably won't hear back about the CFP process until after February 8th. So we need to ask for the deep dives before we actually know if the CFPs were accepted.
We could ask for as many as we would like, right? The upper bound, like not worry about that. Let them negotiate us down type thing. And like, I presume not everyone wants to do a deep dive on we don't want to do one for every single project, but maybe we do.
I mean, if someone from every project wants to present a deep dive, then maybe we should ask for them and see what they say. Right?
I think that makes sense. For the record, March 5th is when we'll hear back on the CFP process. So well after February 8th.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So Chris put the link for the cloud provider topic he was talking about in chat, and I also pasted that into the meeting notes so that we can follow up on that. Again, this is not particularly urgent, other than the fact that I wanted to put it out there so people can start thinking about if they, I guess it's a reminder that the CFPs are due on Friday. So if you did want to submit a CFP, you've got 2 more days to do that. And that B, that I'm hopefully going to propose we do a cluster API deep dive. Maybe if we get enough CFPs accepted, that becomes not necessary. But I think we should at least try to hold a spot. And if people are interested in doing that, in some ways it would be good if there were different presenters for that than people who had regular talks, so that we get more people up talking about it. But if those are the only people that are going to go to the conference, like I'd rather have those people do the talk as well. So yeah, we certainly have some time to sort that out. And I know that last time we submitted for the talk, and then we were able to shuffle around the specific people doing it even like much later than February 8th. So there's plenty of time, but if you're planning on going to Barcelona and interested in getting up on stage and talking, we should start figuring that part out. Okay, I think that's enough time on that one. Next, Vince isn't here, but we've been talking about updates to bootstrapping. So the first thing is he sent a PR to do some flag refactoring. He put in the PR comments that it's a breaking change. It's basically just a change to the flags we pass into cluster cuddle. So when this gets vendored into the provider repos, and your cluster cuddle documentation should get updated as well. I guess my question for this group was, this also sort of sets the stage for us to have more than one bootstrapper. So right now the bootstrapping code it's either Minikube or an existing cluster. And this allows us to plug in other bootstrappers, right? So the next thing on the list was Vince also has a PR to use Kind as a bootstrapper instead of Minikube. And I know that the AWS provider is already doing that. I think certainly getting the first PR in and being able to experiment with different bootstrappers makes a lot of sense. The third sort of follow on to that is, once we have Kind in, how do we decide what our default should be, right? Like I think Vince was proposing in Slack that we switch Kind to be the default at some point in the future. We need to think about how we pick and when we want to make that sort of change. So I don't know if people have thoughts or comments, about the initial PR, which I think should be merged pretty quickly to allow us to add multiple bootstrappers. The second PR, which is Kind, if people have thoughts plus or minus on Kind. And then third, once we have multiple bootstrappers, how to choose a default.
So
Go ahead.
No, you first, Justin.
Okay. I like this PR. I like that you have multiple bootstrappers. I've been playing with one that just runs the binaries directly. So it's similar to Kind, but without the Docker requirement, which is important in some environments that don't have KVM, don't have Docker. I would suggest one way we could skirt the question of which one should be the default is to force everyone to choose for now. And then in 6 months, or when we go beta or whatever, we do a survey and we say, which one are you using? And then we make that the default, the majority. Or if there is a majority, we can make it the default.
So let me clear. I had a question then. So in what environments does Kind not work?
Environments which don't have Docker installed.
I see. Okay.
There may be other requirements. I'm not aware of, like, because Kind is so cool, right, in terms of networking, but I think it's just Docker that is the only requirement. But that is itself a problem in some CI environments, for example.
Yeah, and I know in terms of sort of environmental requirements, some of the folks from VMware mentioned that Minikube, I think like Loke was mentioning that Minikube didn't work in many environments, right? Which is why we're looking at other bootstrapping options. So I think Kind might work in more environments than Minikube, right? Like it only requires Docker, it doesn't require virtualization, which is less of a hurdle to jump. But then there are places where maybe even the hurdle of Docker is too much, and we should think about other ways to do it too.
So for Kind specifically, there's currently effort to eventually extend it to support multiple CRIs. So it depends the environment, what is the minimum requirement for the environment. But yeah, there is a plan to support other CRIs, definitely.
Cool. How many people here have tried using Kind, out of curiosity?
Love it. Although I'll mention during KubeCon, Ben, he did not. He suggested that Minikube was more mature at this point, and for user-facing applications was probably a better choice. So I would be curious, if we were going to move forward and make kind the default, I'd really be curious in terms of like what his opinion was, if he thought that was appropriate.
I think it makes a ton of sense to check with him. I do think that we are in a much more tightly controlled environment. Like we are running a handful of controllers that we basically know, right? Rather than like using kind to replace Minikube for the local development use case, right? Which is a sort of different, a harder problem.
And in addition, we're also not trying to use kind to sort of do CI things where we're running a version of Kubernetes that we're compiling or is unstable. Like we pick a stable version of Kubernetes to run and a specific thing to run inside of it, right? So yeah, I agree. It's a pretty constrained environment, which hopefully we could make reliable. Okay, I did like Justin's idea of not having a default bootstrapper and forcing an option. So you'd either say use existing cluster, which would be one option, or you'd say use Minikube or use kind or whatever the other one that we might want to plug in the future. That seems like a good answer for now. And if everybody starts complaining, like, I don't want to have to keep passing Minikube every single time because that's all anybody uses, like, then maybe we can make that the default. The PR also refactors the flags a little bit to put Minikube as a prefix to all the Minikube specific flags, which is nice because then it's really obvious if a flag applies to a specific bootstrapper.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think I will also support that argument that not having default, not only for now, but in general also. I'm just wondering that I have not used kind, but probably in the case of Minikube, is it possible that somebody accidentally executes the command and he has got some local setup done which gets messed up because he was not aware that some defaulted out local environment is being used here? So I guess this is so required that I guess at some point user should know that which mechanism is going to be used, and it's good that he provides a flag. Just wondering that is it even possible that accidental execution can destroy the local environment?
Sorry, just to clarify, Hardik, you're saying that at some level, the user should understand like what the bootstrapper is doing because they're going to have like installed Minikube or something to like actually make it work. So asking them to pass a flag that says, yes, I installed Minikube, please use that, doesn't seem like a bad idea. Is that what you're saying?
So I think defaulting does not seem to be a good idea to me, because if you have some local setup done for a certain local environment, and if you accidentally execute the clear plus API command, user not knowing that this local environment is going to be used for this purpose, then things can go wrong here, and that's it. I guess it's better that user provides explicitly a flag. But I guess the consensus for now is good. I guess that for now we can keep it required, and let's see in future if there is really a need of defaulting it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think we're mostly on the same page. For now, let's require a flag no matter what, and then in the future we can reassess if we think that there's a better user experience to be had.
I was just going to say that for cluster curl, I was reviewing some PRs in the cluster API repo, and I looked at the code, and I think the flags need some renaming and refactor in terms of the multiple bootstrap options that are going to be available, like kind and Minikube, and also the flags have to be mutually exclusive, for sure. So yeah, that's what I wanted to mention.
Okay. Yeah. Can you add a comment to 686, or we can send a follow-up PR to that one I think that, yeah, I think the way that Vince was trying to do it was by naming each flag with a prefix of the bootstrapper, that would make them mutually exclusive, both in the code and on the command line, because you wouldn't, like every flag will say minikube dash whatever. So if you had minikube dash how much memory or kind dash how much memory, those would be two different flag names, right? And they'd be two different names in the code. So that would dedupe them.
What was the ticket number?
It's 686. I linked it in the notes. I can stick it in chat too if that's easier for you.
Okay.
So yeah, take a look at that. I think Vince has had the same problem. He's like, I need to prefix the flags, A, so it's clear to users, and then B, so that like we can have two flags that do the same thing for different bootstrapper.
So ideally, there should be like the main flag should be like a bootstrap option or something like that. And the common flags should be generic. They should not include like the name of the bootstrap.
Okay, why don't you take a look at the PR and see if you think any of the flags that have the name of the bootstrapper could actually be common flags that would apply everywhere.
Okay. I think I already commented on this one, but yeah, I'm going to take a look later. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, next, David. You're linking to 644.
Right. So one of the issues that I signed up to try to marshal through the process towards V1 Alpha 1 is whether we should establish a stronger link between machines, machine sets, machine deployments, and their cluster. This has been something we've debated for over a year now. And I think it's important that we reach consensus, not just for this milestone, but in order for higher level tooling to be built, there needs to be documentation and test which enforce these relationships or lack thereof, right? So I don't know that, so first I wanted to get people to start thinking about committing to whether clusters are required or not. But since we've been talking about that for a year, I don't think we're going to resolve it in this meeting. There's a lower piece of hanging fruit though. There's an open PR right now to allow the machine actuator to function without the cluster object. I think that this PR, I think, should be merged. I think that there's a warning that it needs to be removed from it, but I wanted to get feedback on what others thought in terms of allowing the machine actuator to operate without a cluster. The argument that I made in the PR and the reason why I think this should be merged is that currently, if you delete a cluster, it then becomes impossible to delete machines. And this results in a poor user experience. Either the user has to recreate a fake cluster in order to delete the machines, or they have to manually patch the finalizer. Either way, they have to understand the internals of the cluster API in a way that only a developer should. So merging this PR would not necessarily determine whether or not there needs to be a link between clusters and machines, but would allow the machine actuator to operate independently of clusters.
I've also hit that bug. It also is incredibly frustrating, and I share that. I feel like it is a special subcase, but I think you're right in that if we merge the PR, require machine actuators to effectively determine whether they're going to handle the cluster, then we can sort of start to see whether people can really write meaningful controllers for the non. I think delete is a special case, like, and everyone. I hope everyone can agree that I should be able to delete a machine deployment if I just create it in the wrong namespace. Not that I've ever done that, but we can see whether people can actually like do the creation of machines in their implementations without a cluster. And if they can, then I think there's a strong case for. I think it gives us evidence for whether or not we need a link or not between clusters and machines, machine deployments.
Yeah, it's a good point.
David, you mentioned that there was a warning in the PR that you thought should be removed. I'm looking at the PR. I don't see a warning.
Let me see if it was removed.
Oh, okay. Maybe that was
Is
already.
this-
Oh, I see. Then maybe it's this first one that Justin commented on. This message is going to be annoying for people.
right.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
I can fix that.
That sounds like my sort of PR review comment.
Okay. So I think the last time we discussed this during the meeting, Siddharth was the sort of main objector, and I don't think that he's here today. I think most other people had agreed that this should be okay to go in. So I would suggest that maybe we ping him and give him a relatively short timeout to raise any further objections, let MSM rebase, and then try to merge this in a couple of days if he doesn't have objections. How does that sound, David?
I can rebase and send the updates end of day today.
Okay, I'm just putting Justin's note into the meeting notes because I think that's important for Siddharth to see if he doesn't watch the recording.
I would say we should even probably think whether we need a cluster reference, why one nil cluster reference is needed. Because I don't see any, at least I was not there probably in the meeting to see the counter arguments, but I cannot probably think of even a single use case why we would need a cluster object in their interface as such. Yeah, let's see.
So I think there's a debate on whether you need to have access to the cluster from the machine actuator. And there's a case that could be made that the machine actuator, if it needs access to the cluster object, it can find it itself, right? Maybe it can be an opt-in functionality. And just to Justin, I think Justin made the point that by merging this PR, we can gather evidence to whether or not that's true, right? Whether actuators require the cluster object. The reason that there is this open question of whether machines and clusters are actually, the reason there's an open question in my mind on whether clusters should be required or not, and I'll just put this out there so people can think about it for the coming weeks, is one of the things the cluster object provides right now, well, it provides two things. It provides some minimal networking information in the spec, and then it provides an API endpoint in the status. The API endpoint is useful in determining when the control plane has been provisioned. There used to be a ticket about this that has now been moved into the GCP repo, unfortunately. So
we can move it back if that's the wrong place.
Well, I don't know that it's the wrong place, but I don't think that GCP is the only provider where this semantic information is useful. And so the open question to the community is, so I think it is highly useful to have some way to determine when your control plane is provisioned. And one way might be to say that it's the API endpoint field in the cluster object. If we set that, then we would require the cluster object in order to have that semantic meaning for higher level tooling to be built on. There are other proposals which are not going to probably make it into V1 Alpha 1, whereby we might split up control plane provisioning from the cluster object. This is something Vince proposed recently, right? If you did that, then the way you would determine if the control plane was provisioned or not would not depend on the API endpoint field. So my goal is, I think that the cluster API should provide a way for higher level tooling to determine when the control plane is ready. And right now, the closest thing we have to that is this field, which is optional, which makes it not dependable, and therefore you can't build higher level tooling on top of it.
Yeah, in some ways, I think that's a little bit orthogonal because the question is whether the machine actuator needs to know that or not, right? The machine actuator probably needs to be told, here's the endpoint where you should tell the machine to register to, But I'm not sure it needs the whole cluster object. Certainly for delete, it doesn't even need that information. And if we have a different way to specify where the cluster endpoint is, or the machine actuator can figure it out itself, then the cluster object is just really a dummy thing that we're forcing people to put in just to plumb that data through, right? I think that's what Justin was saying, is like in COPS, they could create a cluster object if it's required to get the data there, but they have the data elsewhere, and it's just as easy to get it like through the current means, right? And that's just sort of forcing them to do it to jump through hoops, as opposed to because it's actually necessary, right?
So to me, this poses a different question. The question that basically, is machine the wrong abstraction here? Like, we're basically combining Kubernetes machine with machine, right? And we're assuming that it'll always be a Kubernetes machine that is being managed, whereas all the functionality that the machine actuator and the machine set controller and the machine deployment controller is completely agnostic to if it's Kubernetes or not, right? It doesn't really care. It basically, all it cares about is if there's a VM or there's like a bare metal machine somewhere that is running and is reporting healthy. Maybe that's also something that we should think about.
Yeah, I think this brings very good design question that I wanted to talk some time back itself. But so I think we need to already think that when we have actuators, or we are already thinking about externalizing the cloud provider specific stuff, right? We need to think that what kind of responsibilities you actually want to give to that code, which is actually not being managed under the cluster itself, right? Because we discussed once that there would be different cloud providers with different levels of different kinds of capabilities and reliability points, right? So I would expect that at some point we give the minimum responsibility to the actuator, where the job of the actuator should be only to create the machine and delete the machine as instructions are given, and not really worry about how the machine object itself, or probably how the cluster object itself is looking at. So this is also a kind of learning that I see from the CSI model, which I was recently implementing the gRPC drivers for MCN, and I learned from them that they're also it's intentional that they don't want to give the kubeconfig as such to the out of tree drivers. So if you give the kubeconfig kind of information to the out of tree drivers, then at some point the pattern will start evolving there, where the code inside will start modifying the machine objects, machine status objects, code will start modifying the cluster status object, and so on. And then there will not be homogeneous behavior across different cloud providers, when specifically for the multi-cloud offering folks, the experience will not be homogeneous. Different actuator will completely manage the machines and so on completely differently.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. At least I agree with it.
So I'm not hearing a lot of, or any objections necessarily to this pull request on the call. Again, I think we should make sure we are inclusive and ping the folks who had mentioned in the past that they had some concerns, and maybe set a timeout on that and try to get this specific PR merged to, like as Justin said, allow people to start experimenting about what we can build if we take this out and whether that's useful or not. I think the other discussions are also really useful, and I think are helping us with the sort of medium and longer term direction. Any final thoughts before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay, Hardik, machine health strategy.
Yes. So I was recently looking at this issue and wanted to scope down the requirements here. So for the V1 Alpha 1, let's say, how do we look at the machine health strategy? What kind of health issues we want to surface, and what kind of health issues we want to actually solve? So I had basically in the last comment, I had put mainly two objectives, which I see as low-hanging fruits, where the conditions are already available from the node conditions. So first one is the timeouts. So basically when kubelet stops responding for a certain period of the time, we can consider that the machine is unhealthy, and we can replace basically the machine object and let the machine side create the new machine object. That was one. And the second was that when the disk pressure is high, let's say in a particular machine. So if disk pressure is high, then should be probably a relatively longer timeout. We can probably give 30 minutes or so, just a guess, where application also gets some chance to do some kind of cleanup if it could. But otherwise, if disk pressure is really happening, I have seen the behaviors where the machine can actually go unusable. So the new pods may get scheduled, but then they don't get enough space on the host path, host machine anytime anyway. And so the second use case is just fine. But then for the first use case, I saw the comment from Robert that on GCP, which I was not really aware of. So I have heard about the node auto repair feature in GKE, where if machine is not healthy for a certain period of time, GKE replaces it. But I was not aware of the GCP's this part where if kubelet does not respond, let's say for 5 minutes, then it deletes the node object. So who deletes the node object, and then is the machine also replaced, or is it up to the user to make sure that the new machine is created and the old one is gone?
Yeah, so it doesn't do anything with the underlying infrastructure other than query it. So I'm not sure if I said this quite correctly here. So what it does is, if the kubelet stops heartbeating, it will check with GCE and say, does that machine still exist? And if that machine is gone, then it will delete the node. And that's basically to capture the, like, you had a machine, you had something in your cluster, it went away, right? Like you had a MIG, you scaled it down by 1, something disappeared. The way that we notice that and we remove the node object is we see that it stops heartbeating, and then we delete it later. So like, assuming that you've sort of stranded it, right? Like that's sort of the fail safe if we don't like do it sort of correctly, where you delete it as you're scaling down, right? That's sort of the common code path, but then you get this is sort of the cleanup code path if that fails. And so I think in that environment, I think the timeout default for that is about 5 minutes. And so that would always kick in before your proposed timeout of 10 minutes for if we stop heartbeating, right? And that's not to say like this would be sort of another backstop, and again would work in other environments that don't have that cloud provider integration. It's also a little bit different in the sense, and I don't think I thought about this when I was putting my note in, the GCE integration at least will only delete the node object if the underlying VM is gone. And what you're proposing is, even if the underlying VM is there, we delete and replace the machine, through the machine set, which will cause the VM to be deleted and recreated, right?
Yeah.
So it's different in that
That's
sense.
correct.
That sounds like
could actually be there. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
what GKE does, right?
Yes, I think that's what Hardik was saying. Is it's more similar to like GKE's node repair than it is to what I was pointing out, which is the GCP cloud provider integration that helps clean up orphaned node objects for machines that no longer exist.
Right.
So yes, exactly. So to what I wanted to actually come to a consensus with that, if these two objectives looks good enough, or if there is an idea to include in the first cut itself, then we can probably take it up. Or the next step that I'm seeing is that in future, probably when we actually put the NPD, we will expect that we will get more node conditions from the machines and we can take better actions, but that should probably come later. So if these two objectives are good enough, or I could see both of them actually at least make some sense. If there are more suggestions for new conditions, we can probably add in the issue and scope down the issue that this is what needs to be done for the Vival or found exactly. So, yeah.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, I haven't read, I'm trying to read the whole issue and catch up. What is the mechanism for doing this? And is it extensible? Or like, in other words, if I have a particular strategy for my machines, or if I say like, I'm going to run my GPU super hot and then I shut them down when the GPU like is about to melt, right? Like, can I plug that in, or do I have to like write a machine controller, something in the machine controllers, or can I just write my own little controller separately?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Is like, if we were to do it like using conditions or something, I would assume that's easy to add conditions. But yeah, maybe in the conditions we can specify if it's a permanent or temporary or something.
Yes, exactly. So for now, this suggestion is the implementation wise, we will actually be looking at only the node conditions, which is exactly the kubelet not ready and the disk pressure. So if, let's say, your machine is really, really hot on the CPU, and if because of that, if these conditions are not really affected, then probably machine controller at this level will not take any action. But if you want machine controller to take action and probably make the mechanism extensible, probably by outside driver or external controllers, then that should be possible. Just that those conditions should be piped inside that same array of node conditions that we have, where the new condition pops up saying that the CPU is hot. Now, a controller should decide this is the action I should take for that particular machine.
Yeah, I guess there might be another answer to your question, Justin, which is, I think the proposal here is to put this in the machine set controller code, which would make this behavior common and built in. And if you wanted to do other ways of identifying unhealthy machines, you could always, delete individual machines yourself out of band, and the machine set controller would replace them for you. Or if and when we implement these scale down by specific machine requests from the autoscaler folks, you could do it that way too and say, hey, machine set controller, I guess you wouldn't need to scale down. You just delete the machine, right? You just say like, this machine looks bad, delete. This machine looks bad, delete. And the machine set controller should just replace them for you, right? So this would be sort of the built-in behavior that does that automatically in specific situations which you think are common enough to encode in the core basically. And that, like, I think Hardek's proposing a small set of those, which we think are common. We can always add other ones outside of core and or inside of core in the future based on sort of how we see it behave.
And it sounds like there is a mechanism in that if we wanted to have some complicated, like after 5 minutes that the CPU is too hot, then we shut it down, like behavior, we could do that with conditions. And so given we are, I think pre-alpha, this makes a ton of sense to merge in wherever we can get it in and see where we go, see how we go type thing.
Is there a PR for this, or is this just a issue right now?
I think there is no PR yet. So if you see, this is the actual scope that start working on it.
Okay.
Okay. Did that give you enough information to move forward, Hardek?
Yes. I think it's...
Okay. And Messam was just asking about a PR. I assume since this is assigned to you that you are on the hook for sending us a PR to do this.
Yes, we'll do that.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So I will have a question here. How would that PR work with HA on kubeadm? Because there is such a thing. I think there's a PR on HA. I can't say this, pronounce this. HA on kubeadm project. So maybe this could be,
Because I'm not really knowledgeable on that. How do you see the HA on kubeadmin affecting this part?
I'm trying to think out loud, to be honest. Sorry, I'm connecting through phone. And so I won't send you this now. But yeah, when you go to kubeadm, there's this HA thing, and in kubeadm nodes is like the first thing to take care of. And I think that what is being talked at this moment is like a good basis for where to go with it. Maybe there's some common things that we could, locate and talk through. And just thinking out loud,
Yeah, I think the way that I think it would interact right now, and I don't know if anybody that's been working on the HA stuff in the AWS providers is on the line. They can talk to that because I know it uses kubeadm. Is that the machine controller would watch the machines that represent the control plane, like that are running the master for that cluster. And so if those machines were represented as a set of machines, then the machine set controller would notice that one was unhealthy and replace it. And that would rebuild the machine, which would rerun whatever startup script is there, which would need to be resilient to this fact and rejoin and reform that HA control plane. The other option is you could make that HA control plane out of individual machines instead of a set, in which case this behavior would not apply. But I think it really depends upon the implementation of how you are stitching together that HA control plane with kubeadm. And if you're going to put that in a machine set, you need to make it resilient to the fact that any one of those machines can go down and come back up.
I think you've made a great distinction there, Robert, which is the idea that a machine set is fungible machines, right? That is a nice one, because I think I don't know your name, the person actually commented. You raise a great point. Like if we are running masters and they are deleted when the disk fills up, and we are running on the local disk and etcd grows, they're all going to be deleted at exactly the same time, which is very much not what you want, right? But I think the argument that a machine, you would then create 3 machines for an HA control plane is a very strong one, I think.
Or 3 machine sets if you wanted to do some things like that. I mean, like, maybe that wouldn't make sense. It's like machine sets of size 1. I don't know if that gives you an advantage over.
I mean, I think as I understood what you were saying is that a machine set declares that these are replaceable, whereas a machine means that these are pets. And if I am running my masters as pets because they are using the local disk, they are machines. If they are using an EBS volume or a GCPD that we can mount, then I can treat them as a machine set because they are cattle or whatever we're calling them, pet sets.
Right. Or if when you create your control plane, you run a init on one and join on the others, and you have different startup scripts and flags, and like those are very specific, then they're pets, and you shouldn't put them in a set because you won't be able to just replace them, right?
Do we need a concept of like stateful machines? I don't know.
I hope we can figure it out. I think there's some work going, like the etcd ADM project, which I'm working on, should hopefully eliminate the asymmetry there. So hopefully not. Like it can do the mounting volumes, and it doesn't need you to run join and then init. You can just run go on all 3.
All right, we have a couple more agenda items and about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to move to the next one, Lubomir, which is proposing some code cleanups.
Yeah, I just wanted to make raise a couple of points because I was browsing the code base after reviewing some PRs from Jason, and I saw that the word master is still used in UX exposed way, and I mean it's okay to use it in the code base, but we should probably rename everything to be control plane, as this is a steering committee recommendation. And I can log issue for that. And the next one I can also log an issue for that is that Tim St. Clair suggested that for kubeadm, we started basically omitting the use of format error F, and instead we started using the package error package, which for some reason is not in the standard library. I do not know why, but this is something that Tim recommended, and we pretty much redid kubeadm to use this. It has a wrapper for errors, and it's arguably the cleaner way of doing it. So for the first one is clear. Robert, if you want me to log an issue for the second one, if you approve what Tim is saying, I can do that as well.
Oh, this is great. I haven't seen this package before. I wrote something like this myself.
I want to clarify. I think PKG is just a group that was very clever in their naming, right? Like if I registered my GitHub handles official Golang, right? I think that's what they've done there. So there's nothing special about PKG.
Yes, but it's still outside of the library.
Right, because it's not anything to do with the Go team, is I think the issue. This is a third-party dependency, which doesn't make it bad. It just means that it's like we should be, like there's nothing. The other thing is there is apparently this happening in Go 2 whenever this is going to, I think it's on their list of topics, so I don't know.
Yeah, their roadmap basically says we're moving into maintenance mode because Go 2 is going to not require this to not be necessary anymore.
Yes, I remember I had to import it. Like it was not in standard library. Okay, yeah, that's.
Okay, I'm going to log a couple of issues for this, and hopefully somebody from the community can pick them up and do the refactor.
Yeah, please mark them as help wanted, or maybe you can't label things. I can mark them as help wanted.
I'm going to try. Okay.
All right, and then finally in the last couple minutes, Messim snuck something on here about autoscaler scaling down.
I was just wondering if there's been any progress made in the context of like being able to delete a specific machine. If not, that's also fine. Answer. I just haven't been here for a month, so.
Yeah, I think there've been a lot of discussions, but no agreement on exactly how we want to do it yet.
Okay, is there a good place to start?
I think we've, during our issue triage, we consolidated down to a single issue to discuss this. Okay. And what I would suggest is people who are interested to rally around that issue and to find interested parties and sort of start having a discussion either in a Google Doc or we can try to use this meeting, but I worry that it'll either take this whole meeting or not have enough time to be fruitful, and to sort of try to drive that sort of as almost a separate discussion with a smaller group of people that really care and bring back an answer to this meeting.
Sounds good.
So both for you and anyone else who's here that is interested in scaling down, I know folks from Red Hat were interested. They've been sending PRs to the cluster autoscaler repo. I know that Hardik is interested. Let's please all go to that one issue, find a set of people that care, and get those people to work together to fix it. Cool. All right, and with that, we are just about at the top of the hour. Thanks everyone for coming. We didn't have a chance to go through and look at sort of the 23 issues in the V1 Alpha 1 milestone today. I would encourage people to go ahead and try to do that on their own over the next week if they care. I think what we'll try to do in the next couple of meetings is either chunk them and say we'll go through 5 or 10 per week, or we'll pull out specific ones that we think are either blocked or need someone to work on them. So we can really start trying to burn down that list as we go forward. So again, please take a look. And thanks for coming, and we'll see folks in a week. Take care.
Take care.